Sit with me for a moment. Let me tell you something I carried in my heart for years. There was a day when I realized I had become invisible inside my own family. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but slowly, quietly, like a shadow fading at sunset. I was 52 years old when it finally sank in. That morning began like every other. I woke before anyone else, as I always had. The house was still dark, the air cold, the silence heavy but familiar. I wrapped my cardigan tighter around myself and walked into the kitchen, careful not to make noise. I didn't want to wake anyone. I never wanted to be a burden. I boiled water for tea, the kettle whistling softly. As I waited, I stared at the small crack in the wall above the sink. I remembered when that crack first appeared, years ago, during an argument between my husband and our eldest son. No one ever fixed it, just like so many other things. I prepared breakfast the way I always did. Toast, eggs, tea, simple, familiar, safe. When my husband came in, he barely looked at me. He sat at the table, picked up the newspaper and said, "Is the tea ready?" "Yes," I replied softly, placing the cup in front of him. No thank you, no smile, just expectation. Our children followed soon after. My daughter scrolled on her phone. My sons talked among themselves about work, money plans, things that never included me. I sat there with them, physically present, emotionally absent. I tried to join the conversation once. "I was thinking," I said gently, "maybe we could—" "We'll talk later, Mom," my eldest son interrupted, not even looking up. Later never came. That moment stayed with me longer than it should have. It wasn't anger that hurt. It was dismissal, as if my words had no weight, as if I had already spoken too much simply by opening my mouth. After breakfast, I cleaned the table, washed the dishes, wiped the counters. My husband left for work without saying goodbye. The children left one by one, each in a hurry, each wrapped in their own lives. The door closed, and just like that, I was alone. I sat down in the living room on the same chair I had used for years. The fabric was worn, the armrest slightly torn. I placed my hands in my lap and looked around the room. Every object had a memory. The photo on the wall, our family years ago, all smiling. I remembered taking that picture, reminding everyone to stand close. Back then, they needed me. The bookshelf filled with books I never had time to read. The clock, ticking steadily, reminding me that time never waits for women like me. I thought about my life. I had married young. I had left my job when the children were born. "We don't need 2 incomes," my husband had said. "You're better at home." At the time, it sounded like love. Years passed. Responsibilities grew. Dreams shrank. I became the woman who remembered birthdays, doctor appointments, school meetings. The woman who stayed up late when someone was sick. The woman who smiled even when she was exhausted. And somewhere along the way, I stopped being seen. That afternoon, my sister called. "How are you?" she asked. I opened my mouth to answer, but the words caught in my throat. "I'm fine," I said automatically. After hanging up, I laughed quietly at myself. Fine. That word had become my shield. The easiest lie to tell. In the evening, everyone returned home. I served dinner. They ate, they talked, they laughed. I watched them. Not one person asked how my day had been. Not one. That night, as I lay in bed beside my husband, listening to his breathing, I felt something heavy settle in my chest, a realization I could no longer ignore. I had given them everything, and somehow I had given away myself too. I turned to face the wall, my eyes burning. I wasn't angry. I wasn't bitter. I was grieving. Grieving the woman I used to be. Grieving the voice I no longer used. Grieving the respect I never demanded. And as sleep finally took me, one thought repeated itself in my mind over and over again. What happens to a woman when everyone forgets she is human too? That question would change everything. Silence did not arrive in my life all at once. It crept in slowly, like fog rolling over a quiet field. At first it felt harmless. Then it became heavy. Then it became everything. After that morning, the one where I realized I was invisible, I began to notice how often I stayed quiet. Not because I had nothing to say, but because I had learned that my words rarely landed anywhere. I stopped offering opinions, stopped sharing worries, stopped expressing disappointment. Silence became easier than rejection. A few weeks later, my husband announced during dinner that he was planning to renovate part of the house. "We'll convert the spare room into an office," he said, speaking mostly to our sons. I paused. That spare room had always been my space. The only place where I kept my sewing machine, old notebooks, and the small wooden box where I stored letters. photos and unfinished thoughts. I used that room, I said quietly. He looked at me, confused. You don't need it anymore. That sentence stayed with me. I didn't argue. I nodded and continued eating, even though my appetite vanished. That night, I went into the room and touched the walls, the desk, the chair where I used to sit when the house felt too loud. I packed my things into a single cardboard box. No one noticed. As days passed, I began shrinking my presence. I woke earlier, slept later, moved around the house quietly. Like a guest afraid of overstaying, my daughter started confiding in her friends instead of me. I overheard her once in the kitchen saying, "Mom wouldn't understand." That hurt more than she knew. Understanding had once been my strength. One afternoon, I felt dizzy while folding laundry. I sat down, my heart racing. For a moment, I considered telling someone. I imagined calling my husband, my children. Then I imagined their responses. "Drink some water. You're fine. Don't worry so much." So I said nothing. That was the day I realized how dangerous silence could be, not just emotionally, but physically. The world outside my home was changing too. Neighbors moved away. Old friends stopped calling. Life narrowed. One evening, my husband returned home frustrated. Work had been stressful. He vented for nearly an hour while I listened, nodding, offering tea. When he finished, he sighed in relief. "Thank you," he said. "It helps to talk." I almost laughed, because I had nowhere to put my own words. That night, I opened the wooden box I had hidden in my wardrobe. Inside were old letters I had written but never sent, pages filled with thoughts, dreams, fears. I read them slowly, recognizing a woman who once believed her voice mattered. I took out a notebook and began writing again. Not for anyone else, for myself. I wrote about the loneliness, the invisibility, the quiet pain of being taken for granted. Writing became my refuge, the only place where I could speak freely without being interrupted or dismissed. But silence still ruled my days. Until the afternoon, everything shifted. It happened when my husband collapsed in the living room. I heard the sound, something between a thud and a gasp. I rushed in and found him on the floor, struggling to breathe, his face pale. In that moment, silence vanished. I shouted for help. I called an ambulance. I took control. At the hospital, doctors spoke quickly, using words that felt sharp and heavy. My children arrived, panic on their faces, suddenly looking at me differently. They needed me again. I spent nights in that hospital chair, watching machines blink and beep. I held my husband's hand while he slept, weaker than I had ever seen him. One night he opened his eyes and looked at me, truly looked at me for the first time in years. "You've always been here," he whispered. I nodded, tears streaming silently down my face. "Yes," I said, "I have." In that sterile hospital room, surrounded by white walls and quiet machines, I felt something stir inside me. Not anger, not bitterness. Awareness. Silence had protected me for years, but it had also erased me. And as I sat there, holding his fragile hand, I made a quiet promise to myself. I will not disappear again. That promise would lead me down a path I never expected, one that would test my strength, my patience, and my understanding of justice. But first, I had to learn how to speak again. The hospital smelled like disinfectant and quiet fear. I became familiar with every sound, the rolling carts in the hallway, the soft footsteps of nurses, the rhythmic beeping of machines that reminded me time was still moving. Even when life felt paused, my husband survived the night. The doctor said it was a warning, not the end. "He will need rest," she said. "And support." I nodded, because support was something I had given my entire life. But something was different now. When we returned home, the house felt unfamiliar. My children suddenly asked questions, real ones. "Did you sleep? Have you eaten? Do you need help?" Their concern felt awkward, almost rehearsed, but it was there. I answered politely, but I observed quietly. I noticed how quickly care appeared when strength disappeared. My husband spent most days on the couch, pale and tired. He relied on me for everything: medicine, food, comfort. Sometimes he would reach for my hand and hold it longer than necessary, as if afraid I might vanish. One afternoon, he said something that stopped me. "I don't know how I managed without noticing you all these years." I looked at him, really looked at him. His voice carried regret, but also fear. "We manage because someone always fills the gaps," I said softly. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I returned to the spare room, the one that was no longer mine. I stood there, surrounded by boxes and unfinished renovations. For the first time, I didn't feel like asking permission. I cleared a small corner, I brought in a chair, a lamp, and my notebook. It wasn't much, but it was mine. And I began writing again. Not just pain this time, but questions. What do I want? Who am I when no one is watching? What do I deserve? These were dangerous questions for a woman like me. Questions I had avoided for decades. As weeks passed, my husband grew stronger. The children slowly returned to their routines. Their concern faded, but I didn't. I had changed. I began doing small, quiet things differently. I spoke when something mattered. I said no when I was tired. I took walks alone in the evenings, feeling the cool air remind me that I was alive. At first they were confused. "Where are you going?" my daughter asked one evening. "For a walk," I replied. "Now?" "Yes, now." No explanation, no apology. The world didn't end. That realization was powerful. One afternoon, my husband found my notebook by accident. He didn't read it, just held it. "I didn't know you still wrote," he said. "I never stopped," I replied. "I just stopped showing it." Something shifted between us then. Not magically, not completely, but enough. Then came the appointment with the lawyer. It was meant to be routine, paperwork, updates, planning just in case. My husband asked me to come along. "I want you there," he said. We sat in a quiet office, wooden furniture polished and serious. The lawyer spoke mostly to him at first. Then unexpectedly, he turned to me. "And what do you want, Mrs. Harris?" The question startled me. What did I want? The room felt still. Everyone waited. I took a breath. "I want fairness," I said. "And clarity." The lawyer nodded. My husband looked at me surprised. That was the first time in years that my voice entered a room and stayed there. Over the next few weeks, more conversations followed. Hard ones, honest ones. My husband began asking my opinion, slowly, carefully. I didn't push. I didn't demand. I simply existed, fully. And that, I learned, can be the most powerful thing a woman can do after years of invisibility. But change does not go unnoticed. My eldest son started watching me more closely. My daughter seemed uneasy. There were whispers, glances, discomfort. They sensed something shifting, something they could not control. I didn't know it then. But the moment I found my voice was the moment others began to fear losing theirs. And the real conflict had only just begun. Change rarely announces itself. It whispers. And those who benefit from your silence are always the first to hear it. I noticed the shift in the house before anyone said a word. Conversations stopped when I entered a room. Plans were discussed without me, then casually mentioned later, as if I were expected to agree automatically. Old patterns trying to survive. One evening, my daughter suggested we organize finances for the future. She said it gently, but her eyes were sharp. My eldest son agreed too quickly. "It's just practical," he said. "Dad's health, the house, everything." I listened quietly, letting them speak. They spoke about me, not to me. That night, I returned to my notebook and wrote a single sentence. "They are afraid of my awareness." Fear does strange things to people. My husband, recovering faster now, began avoiding the topic altogether. When I tried to speak, he would change the subject or grow tired suddenly. It wasn't anger, it was avoidance. And avoidance is a kind of betrayal. A few days later, I overheard my children speaking in the kitchen. My name came up, followed by words like emotional and confused. Confused, I smiled sadly. For years, my silence was called patience. Now my clarity was called confusion. I didn't confront them immediately. I waited. Then came the document. It was left on the dining table carelessly, as if I wouldn't read it. A power of attorney form. My name was missing. I sat there for a long time staring at the paper. So this was it. They didn't want my voice. They wanted my absence. That evening, I called a lawyer of my own, not out of anger, out of self-respect. The office was smaller, quieter. The woman across from me listened carefully while I spoke. I didn't rush. I didn't apologize. "I have been invisible for a long time," I said. "I don't intend to be anymore." She nodded. "Then let's make sure your future reflects that." Walking out of that office, something inside me settled. I wasn't fighting anyone. I was protecting myself. When I returned home, the house felt tense. My daughter avoided my eyes. My son spoke carefully. My husband sensed it. "What's going on?" he asked. I handed him the document. "I found this," I said calmly, "and I've taken steps to understand my own rights." He looked at me, truly looked at me, with a mix of shock and realization. "You didn't think to ask me," I continued. "You assumed I wouldn't mind." Silence filled the room. Finally, he said, "I didn't think you cared." That sentence hurt more than all the others. "I cared so much," I replied softly. that I forgot to care about myself. He didn't respond, and that was enough. From that day forward, I moved carefully, deliberately. I gathered records. I organized documents. I asked questions. The children grew uneasy. Their friendliness felt forced now. They were losing control. One night, my son confronted me. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. "You're tearing the family apart." I looked at him, really looked at him. "No," I said. "I'm finally standing in it." Tears filled his eyes, not from guilt, from fear of losing what he thought was guaranteed. That night, I slept peacefully for the first time in years. Because justice doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it begins with a woman choosing not to be quiet anymore. The hardest conversations are never loud. They don't come with shouting or slammed doors. They arrive quietly, carrying years of unspoken truth. And they change everything once spoken. I asked them all to sit together on a Sunday afternoon. My husband, my children. The living room felt heavy, as if the walls themselves were listening. No one spoke at first. I began calmly. "I know about the documents," I said. "I know about the plans that didn't include me." My daughter opened her mouth, then closed it again. My son stared at the floor. My husband sighed deeply. "We were trying to protect you," he said. I nodded slowly.
Protection without respect is control.
That sentence landed hard. I didn't accuse. I didn't raise my voice. I simply told my story, the years of silence, the room that was taken from me, the decisions made over my head, the way my health and opinions were dismissed. As I spoke, something unexpected happened. They listened, not defensively, not impatiently. They listened because for the first time, I wasn't asking permission to speak. Tears filled my daughter's eyes. "I didn't realize," she whispered. "I know," I replied gently, "because I trained you not to." That truth hurt us all. My husband finally looked at me with shame instead of confusion. "I took you for granted," he said. "I thought you'd always be there, no matter what." "I was," I said, "but I shouldn't have disappeared to make that possible." The conversation stretched on for hours. There were apologies, some sincere, some clumsy, some too late. But I wasn't seeking guilt. I was seeking acknowledgement. Then I said the words that changed everything. "I've updated my will. I've named myself as decision-maker over my own life. And I will no longer agree to arrangements that erase me." No one argued, because they finally understood. This wasn't rebellion. It was survival. That evening, after everyone left the room, my husband sat beside me. "I'm afraid," he admitted. "So am I," I said. But fear doesn't excuse silence. For the first time in decades, we spoke as equals. That night, I returned to my notebook and wrote the last sentence of a chapter that had defined my life. I am not invisible. I never was. But this story wasn't about punishment or revenge. It was about balance. The final part would come not from confrontation, but from consequence. From the quiet realization that respect, once lost, must be rebuilt carefully. And not everyone is willing to do that work. Justice does not always arrive like a storm. Sometimes it comes softly, like the steady return of light after a long winter. After that conversation, the house changed. Not immediately, not dramatically, but in ways that mattered. My children began asking instead of assuming. Small things at first, opinions about dinner, plans for the weekend, questions that acknowledged my presence instead of stepping over it. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. My husband tried too, awkwardly, earnestly. He would ask how I felt, then actually wait for the answer. Sometimes he didn't like what he heard. Sometimes neither did I. But we stayed in the conversation. That was new. The lawyer finalized the documents a few weeks later. Everything was clear now. My voice, written into every decision that concerned my life. I felt lighter walking out of that office. Not because I had won something, but because I had reclaimed something that was always mine. My evenings became mine again. I returned to walking at dusk, feeling the air cool my skin, listening to my own footsteps. I no longer rushed home out of obligation. I went because I chose to. One afternoon, my daughter sat beside me in the garden. She hesitated before speaking. "I'm afraid of becoming invisible one day," she said quietly. I looked at her and saw myself, years ago. "You won't," I told her. "Not if you learn to speak before silence becomes habit." She nodded, holding those words carefully. That moment alone made everything worth it. My son changed more slowly. Respect for him came with effort. But even he began to understand that strength isn't about control. It's about restraint. As for my husband, he never fully forgave himself. I didn't ask him to. What I asked for was Months passed. The house felt different now, not because power had shifted, but because balance had returned. I reclaimed my room, my writing space, my quiet. One evening I sat alone, reading through my old notebooks. The woman in those pages felt distant now, not weak, but unfinished. I closed the book and smiled. I had finished that story. This one was mine. If there is one truth I learned, it is this. Silence may keep the peace, but it steals the self, and love without respect is not love. It is convenience. I did not seek revenge. I did not seek punishment. I sought recognition. And in doing so, I taught everyone around me a lesson they will carry for the rest of their lives, including myself. I leaned back in my chair, listening to the evening sounds, finally at ease. For the first time in a long time, I was not waiting to be heard. I already was. If this story touched your heart, stay with me. There are many more stories still waiting to be told.